You're going to share your screen, but let me just make sure you can do that because, hold on. Yeah, here.
And I got to make sure that I'm showing you like the projection screen, not the screen that I'm reading my notes from. You know, that would be embarrassing. So,
Exactly.
Thank you, Sam, for letting me come to this meeting. What I want to do today is I want to teach you sort of about, it's almost like introducing you to an old friend. I'm going to introduce you to something called the five-finger approach, which for me has been a kind of a trusted clinical companion. And what I want to do, what I want y'all to do is just understand where this paper came from, because I think it's something that can help all of us, not just as providers, but as human beings, understand and unpack something that as complex as a sleep-wake complaint. So what I'm going to do today is I'm not going to kind of take you through the paper, which you can read on your own. I'm going to teach you and just walk you through some of the stories of where this thing came from and why I think it's useful. And maybe you can find a place for my old friend in your life as well. So I'm going to start with this. When people come to us, they don't really come to us asking for help with a label, you know, although that's what often happens is we help them with an airway issue or something like that. Most people come to folks wearing white coats because they want help and they want to talk to somebody who knows more about this than they do. So they'd like coaching and assistance. They really aren't interested in someone who can just tell them about just one area of their problem. They want coaching. So I'm going to tell you the way I handled this and the way I brought it all back to the patient. Every visit always started with a simple question. And it was, listen, are you satisfied with your sleep? And the answer is yes or no. And if they have to sort of qualify it, well, yeah, but except, then the answer is no. Okay, so if you get them to sort of recognize that sleep satisfaction is inherently very subjective, but you can help them decide whether this is a satisfying experience or not. And once they've decided on the binary, then you get them to say, okay, if you're not perfectly satisfied, then let's rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. And here 10 is like, you can't think of a thing you would improve. And 1 is you can't see how this could even be worse, even in your worst imagination. So you get them to rate it and you get them to give themselves a grade. And what I discovered is that this gives you some insight into how much this person is suffering from this and how much they need help. Because basically, if people give themselves something that's inherently a failing grade, like 6, 5, 4, something that would be a fail on a standard classroom assessment, you know that there's something they want to talk about. So whatever their number is, then you get them to put words to it to try to describe why isn't it a 10? What were you thinking about? And for this, I usually break it down into another sort of unpacking. I have them talk about their breathing and snoring related complaints. I have them talk about the sleep experience. I have them talk about the waking experience pertinent to how they sleep. And then I have them talk about things that are going wrong in their life, other medical comorbidities or psychological, psychiatric comorbidities that they think are pertinent to their sleep. Helps them unpack it in a way that becomes useful later for something I call the 5 reasons to treat, which we're not going to talk about today. So if you want to look up my old friend, well, you can either look her up in the reference or you can find her number written on the Google bathroom stall by dialing in 5-finger approach sleep, and you can always find it. There's a PDF available. So much of what I'm going to talk about today has to do with this notion, the notion of complexity. Now, I'm going to assert here that sleep apnea arises from multiple overlapping anatomic, physiologic, and functional deviations from whatever we consider optimum. And there's variable representation of obstructive versus central apnea physiology. The entity known as sleep apnea is probably best characterized as complex. Okay, it's not one thing. So as a result of this complexity, I think a lot of you will agree with me. There is no one size fits all solution, okay, to sleep apnea, this notion of sleep apnea. So if we agree that this is complex, the breathing and the airway issues is complex, think about this. What happens when we remember that the clinical management of breathing and airway related pathology requires navigation of countless non-apnea contributors to sleep-wake complaints? Non-airway, non-apnea. So this nests the complexity of the breathing and airway issues within the complexity of a larger spectrum of sleep provocative disease. And this makes for what I consider to be a truly enormous Leviathan. And might I remind you that you and me, all of us, we have our own small vantage point. So if the thought ever occurred to you that we're going to need a bigger fleet, well, that's really what this talk is about. It's about recruiting more people to the fleet to solve this really complex problem. So when I'm introducing you to my 5-finger tool, I kind of feel like I'm introducing you to a dear and trusted friend who kind of talks way too much. It's like your friend's kind of cool, but she's a talker. It took me an hour last time I said hello, because this is sort of getting into it with people. So the way I want to introduce you to my old friend is by telling you the story where she comes from. And that brings us to the story about Daria. Now, that's not her real name. This is sort of a compressed and fictionalized account of what actually happened. But this is all more or less true, okay? The year was 2008, and I was new faculty at LSU Shreveport Sleep Disorders Center. Back in that day, we were making the transition from electronic to paper records, and I found myself preparing to go into the room of a young woman called Daria. As I ready to go into her room, I looked over her chart notes, and she'd been diagnosed with sleep apnea back in 2003, so it'd been 5 years. And since then, she'd been seen roughly annually. And you guys know what SOAP notes are, maybe. SOAP, subjective, objective assessment and plan. So there's SOAP notes in the paper chart. And it says S, they're all the same. S, subjective. Patient presents for follow-up of OSA, AHI is 5, no complaints, reports compliance with the device, reports benefit. Objective, no distress, no evidence of dermal irritation from the mask. Assessment, OSA doing well on CPAP, 8 centimeters of water. Plan, return to clinic 1 year. Continue present therapy. So these are my notes. And I'm like, I don't even know who this person is. So anyway, I walk into the room with this background, and I double tap on the door like you do. Hi, I'm Dr. McCarty. I'm one of the new sleep medicine faculty here. I understand we're following up for sleep apnea. And in front of me is a woman who has sort of a blank expression on her face. She's got a CPAP machine that's kind of unhinged and sitting in her lap. And she's sort of not making eye contact. And she's like, yeah. And I said, so how you doing with that thing? All right, I guess. Again, expressionless. And I was like, well, do you think it's doing anything good for you? And at this point, Daria looks me in the eye. It was the first time she actually sort of looked at me. And she's like, I don't know. And she was trying to figure out whether I was going to listen to her or not. So I went back to the notes. And I said, well, it says here that you snore. And she says, I don't snore. And I was just about to say, well, yes, you do, because it says here in the chart. But I didn't say that. And instead I said, oh. And I'll cut to the very bottom line here. Daria had been diagnosed with sleep apnea only by just. She'd been given a CPAP machine because she'd presented with daytime sleepiness and difficulty sleeping at night, but her final diagnosis was actually narcolepsy. Okay. And the reason we figured this out, the reason I figured this out with her, was because she wasn't getting any better with this device. But the problem was, somehow people stopped thinking about her as soon as she got a diagnosis that seemed to explain what was going on. And so the notes came note after note. And to me, at the end of this journey, when we finally made her diagnosis and got her on the right treatment, she, by the way, had lost some weight and no longer had even anything that would qualify as sleep apnea in her study anymore. I had to explain to her why we'd been using this CPAP machine for 5 years. And I asked her, Daria, if this isn't doing you any good, if you don't snore, if it's not helping you sleep any better, and it's not helping you feel any better in the daytime, you're still falling asleep on the job, why are you using it? And she looked me in the eye and she said, well, because y'all told me I'd have a stroke if I didn't. And that to me felt like a stab wound in the heart, because her sleep apnea was on the much milder side of the scale and actually didn't represent that much of a cardiovascular risk that we could tell. The main reasons to treat sleep apnea for her would have been for clinical endpoints. So this whole story is to sort of announce what happened in an academic setting when I am responsible for teaching people how to manage other human beings. And this experience felt like a stain. It was an embarrassment to me. It was as if we were a surgical team and we'd sewed up a few sponges and the scalpel into the wound. So what I did at this point is I tried to figure out how we were going to not let this happen again. Because there's different things you can do. What do you do when you sort of come up against this problem? She says, why have I been using this if I don't have sleep apnea that's going to give me a stroke? Do you become defensive? Do you blame the patient? Oh, well, you should have known. Do you give your fellows more training in how to recognize narcolepsy? What had gone wrong? So at that point, I started to do some reading. And by this, I mean, I started obsessively reading about it, about why doctors make mistakes. And I started to come up with some really interesting insights. So here's an English major nerd alert. This is a cool word. I love it. As I was delving into this literature of mistakes, the people who have made a science, a forensic art form out of dealing with medical mistakes are actually the emergency department, the emergency physician literature, because it happens so fast, unlimited information, that they want to figure out, is there cognitive errors that are happening? So I learned a lot from reading about their forensic deconstructions of mistakes made, and from a book called How Doctors Think by a real brilliant writer named Jerome Groopman, who's a physician who's written on this subject. So back to portmanteau. This word means, it comes from a word that means a traveling suitcase that splits exactly in half, like you see there. It also means a blended word for English majors. So a blended word like smoke plus fog equals smog. And I kind of like the image of portmanteau because it sounds like two words have decided to pack up and kind of go on a journey to someplace different. So it's a great visual image for a word. So the portmanteau that's important, we'll get to it in a minute, but here's a bunch of portmanteaus. Let's pack up the van and go have brunch with our favorite frenemy. That's kind of like portmanteaus, when you have too much fun. That's a total dad joke, but that's kind of how I roll. So anyway, the portmanteau that we're going to talk about today is something called the word satisficing. So the type of decision-making error that happened with Daria is called a search satisficing error. And here the word satisficing is a portmanteau of satisfactory and sufficient. And it means that you basically stop thinking about the problem. Once you've found a label that satisfies, it seems to explain, and it's sufficient, it could potentially explain it. You start taking a mental nap. So this is the label that happens, or the medical error that happens in label-based care. When you assign a label to something, you say, this is sleep apnea, you are at risk for falling down into this problem. And neither native intelligence nor good intentions will protect you. You can fall into it. So this is why you'll hear me talking so much about the importance of preserving the patient narrative. All right. So if that's the error, how do we figure out a way for people not to make this mistake? How do we systematize it? How do we build patient-centeredness? What my new friend, Dr. Paul Henney, I don't know if you know him, he's a real important guy in terms of person-centered care in dentistry. He likes to call person-centeredness. I like that because it takes the label patient out of it. But how do we build it into the system, Well, in 2008, at the time I met Daria, I was actually teaching at the medical school. I was teaching a course in physical exam to the senior medical students. And the work involved a review of the cardiac exam. And this had a great robot that you could listen to the different cardiac sounds. And it was called the Harvey because it was invented by this guy, Dr. Proctor Harvey. And part of Dr. Harvey's teaching included this 5-finger mnemonic that he would teach his students how to deconstruct a patient with heart disease so they wouldn't fall into their own cognitive mistakes. And I liked it. I liked the idea that you can maybe unpack something complex into something you can put on a 5-finger mnemonic. So remember our task. We have to get to the bottom of a set of patient complaints. So we always start with the patient, and how do we break it down and systematize it so the narrative doesn't get lost? So I spent 2 years puzzling over that question, sort of beating my head against the wall. And in 2010, I published my response. So again, here's how you can access it. It's the 5-finger approach. Okay, so this is what we're going to get to. But that was 13 years ago. So why am I still talking about this? It is still my favorite fallback Swiss Army knife whenever I'm trying to figure out why somebody is having a negative experience with respect to sleep-wake. I think it's something you can teach to everybody. In fact, this is part of the point of this, this whole talk, is it's not something that you just put in your head and walk around with like the cat who ate all the cream. This is something we teach our patients so that they can help us. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. If I were a carpenter, I would say, this 5-finger approach turned out to be a pretty good house. At 13 years old, it still stands up. I'm still happy about it. So what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to figure out why this matters to me, why this seems so true to me, and why it makes such sense. And I started to read about the notion of complexity and sense-making in complexity. And I started to ask, is anybody else out there talking about this? And the answer is, yeah, just not in my medical silo. I had to go elsewhere. So Mary Douglas was a cultural anthropologist who was fascinated by the use of language and how this shaped cultural norms. The New York Times called her book, Purity and Danger, one of the top 100 nonfiction books of all time at one point. So I found this quote memorable. I'm just going to read it to you. Whatever we perceive is organized into patterns for which we, the perceivers, are largely responsible. Okay, she's talking about our lens and how that changes what we see. As perceivers, we select from all the stimuli falling on our senses, only those which interest us. And our interests are governed by pattern-making tendency. So in a chaos of shifting impressions, each of us constructs a stable world. And as time goes by and experience builds up, we make greater investment in our system of labels. It gives us confidence, okay? This explains the phenomenon known as confirmation bias, seeing what you want to see. The frustrating situation where two individuals can evaluate the same set of data and come up with opposite conclusions, okay? It's the lens, okay? It's why my colleagues missed what was really wrong with Daria. They had the lens that they had it right, okay? So now enter this guy, Dave Snowden. And it's not that Snowden, not the leaker guy. This one's a Welsh complexity consultant. He's the creator of something called the Cynefin framework, spelled C-Y-N-E-F-I-N. It's a Welsh word that means habitat, okay? What he's talking about is whenever we're reality testing, the small habitat where you are makes a difference. Things are different in microenvironments. He understands the way silos can change lenses. So for the past 20 years, he's been consulting to CEOs and titans of industry about how to manage their affairs in a complex world. And now we've got another Dave, right? So that's too many Daves. Y'all seen this one from Dr. Seuss? That cracks me up. I think the year I was born, like 54% of males were named Dave. Okay, so this is just work from Snowden. I'm going to read this to you. This is like a book report because I want you to see what he wrote a long time ago. This is on complexity. Complexity theory studies how patterns emerge throughout the interaction of many agents. That means lots of moving parts, okay? I think that would apply to sleep apnea. In a complex space, there are cause and effect relationships between the agents, but the number of agents and the number of relationships defy categorization or analytic techniques. We don't know what we don't know yet, okay? This is the problem with the label sleep apnea, is it captures so much that it's very difficult to assign it to one singular moving part. Emergent patterns can be perceived, but not predicted, okay? So in other words, if we're in a practice, we're like, oh yes, this happened, this happened, this happened. I'm starting to see a new reality. I'm creating my own lens. That's called retrospective coherence. That problematically introduces the notion of the silo effect, because you're seeing what's around you, but you're not seeing the other side of the Leviathan. All right, structured methods that seize upon such retrospectively coherent patterns and codify them into procedures will confront only new and different patterns for which they're ill-prepared. So think of this as we've created our pattern within our silo. When we see something new, it's not going to be something that we can deal with. Once a pattern is stabilized, its path appears logical, but it's only one of many that could have stabilized, each of which could also have appeared logical in retrospect, okay? So this gives us, again, the same notion of multiple ways of looking at the same Leviathan. Patterns may indeed repeat for a time in this space, but we cannot be sure that they will continue to repeat because the underlying sources of the patterns are not open to inspection. An observation of the system may itself disrupt the patterns. Okay, and this is the kicker. Relying on expert opinions based on historically stable patterns of meaning will insufficiently prepare to recognize and act on unexpected patterns. So when I read this statement, I was thinking about the Pickwickian lens of sleep apnea and how that prepared me to deal with the Leviathan of sleep apnea in my practice. And relying on that expert opinion of what that lens looks like would lead me to miss lots of more subtle presentations where the Pickwickian pattern isn't shown, but the fit, healthy female, the thin, fit, I shouldn't say healthy, but airway challenged female phenotype is a totally different lens, okay? Decision-making within a complex space. So this is from an article that he wrote for Harvard Business Review. Isn't it weird that a doctor's talking about a business review journal article? But this is where this led me, okay? And this is, again, just direct quotes from his paper. The decision model in this, the complex space, is to create probes, meaning you start to ask questions. Create probes to make the patterns or potential patterns more visible before we make any action. Okay, we're not acting on advice laid down by experts. We're starting to question our environment. What questions? Well, we'll get to the 5-finger approach in a minute, but we can then sense those patterns and respond by stabilizing those patterns that we find desirable and destabilizing those that we do not want. Understanding this space requires us to gain multiple perspectives on the nature of the system. This is the time to stand still, okay? Pay attention. Gain new perspective on the situation rather than run for your life, relying on the entrained patterns of past experience. Okay, so I believe, you guys, that this statement explains why we are seeing sort of tragic over-titrations of treatment in different silos. Okay, I'm thinking about the AGA treatment tragedy, and I'm thinking about, numerous unnamed tragic over-titrations of CPAP devices and perhaps even mandibular advancement devices. It's because people get trapped within their own silos, and rather than standing still and starting to ask for new information from their environment, they're basically running for their life using the tool that they understand. So systemic over-titration is part of this problem. So again, another kicker statement for me. The methods, tools, and techniques of the known, which is like you broke your wrist, you set it. That's a simple problem. Knowable. Oh, you have diabetes. You need to manage it with an insulin pump. That's complicated. It's linear and it's predictable, but the tools and techniques of problem solving for those domains don't work here, okay? Narrative techniques are particularly powerful in this space. Okay, read that again. Narrative techniques. What are we talking about here? The patient's narrative. And the reason this blew the back of my head off is that this is a guy writing in a business journal. And when I began this journey of trying to explain the complexity of sleep apnea to myself, to my patients, to my colleagues, the very first installation of this was a podcast episode. Incidentally, it was called Narrative. The entryway to my mythical Isle of Sleep Apnea is called the Bay of Narrative. Okay, this is rooted in one person's narrative, and that is the narrative of our patient. So when we go to the Isle of Sleep Apnea, this is my construct of how to navigate this complexity. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, I'd say the northeast, is 5-finger approach mountain. Okay, and this would have been where this would have been positioned for Daria, okay, because she had already been diagnosed with sleep apnea. She had crossed over the decision river into treated territory, and she was not doing well, okay? So that requires us to go back to the sleep-wake complaints and start asking questions, okay? So it is from this vantage point that we're gonna start talking about that. So why did I go to the trouble of drawing this crazy map? Why make it so accessible? Why try to make it fun? Isn't it enough that the 5-finger approach is published so that egghead nerds like us can read it so that we can, use it to better manage our patient? Isn't it enough that we know it? Is there another place we can go to learn? And, now for something completely different, let's go to war. So what we can learn from an Army general, let's flash back to the early 2000s. And I don't know if any of you remember an entity called Al-Qaeda in Iraq that was headed up by this guy, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was a charismatic, radicalized Muslim. He was a formidable and particularly cruel enemy. And he didn't invent bombing the ambulance after you've bombed the sewage plant, but his group kind of perfected that. And then they'd vanish without a trace, these coordinated attacks, then they'd just be gone. And so what we're going to talk about today is not so much our bad guy. We're going to talk about this guy, General Stanley McChrystal, and how he updated his understanding of how humans can work together to join together some of the most elite strike forces on the planet to track down the slipperiest enemy in history, okay? So to understand this story, we got to go back another step, back to 1980. The American military suffered a humiliating defeat when Operation Eagle Claw, which was spearheaded by the legendary Army Delta Force, failed to rescue 52 American embassy staff members held hostage in their own embassy in Tehran by loyalists to Iran's new leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. A post hoc analysis of the mission's failure, it was called the Holloway Report, cited various services' failure to cohesively work together, okay? They couldn't come together to overcome the complexity, okay? They were too siloed to deal with complexity. So I hope this is starting to ring some bells. So when it came to the new enemy in Iraq, the Joint Special Operations Task Force was the answer to that recommendation, okay? It included 4 of its most elite fighting squadrons in the world. It was SEALs, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Army Delta Force, and Air Force Special Tactics. Each group was so tightly knit that it had an internal philosophy that was externally palpable. And this is actually from General McChrystal's book. If you ask any of them kind of their internal statement of their motto, it's that. Everyone else sucks, okay? So when I was reading this, it kind of made me think of other silos, you know? We've got AASM, AADSM, AAPMD, you know, PANI. I mean, heck, you guys are probably like a Delta Force of your own. You know, we're all in our little sort of tribal silos. Anyway, General Stanley McChrystal was the guy in charge of that task force, okay? And he was going to have to find a way to make them work together. The task force was basically mandated to deal with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it was up to McChrystal, this was his charge, that Eagle Claw wasn't going to happen again. And the problem was that when he arrived on duty and took charge of these 4 special teams, his elite task force was just getting their asses handed to them by the slipperiest enemy on the planet, despite the fact that they were outgunned and heavily outfinanced. So McChrystal put his thinking cap on, and he realized that the major problem with the effectiveness of his teams working together was the fact that they were siloed. You know, if each of his elite units were an individual, it would be like having Pele and Messi and any other Beckham. You've got these great players on your team, but the only training they've ever done is with the coach, and they don't actually trust each other, and they don't know what each other is going to do. So it'd be up to the coach to shout instructions to all the players from the sidelines, to tell them what to do to coordinate. This is sort of the need to know type of mentality for complex missions. The commanders know, and Deltas just need to go in and pick up this one drop and then drop it off. They don't know how it all works together. He realized that if he was going to find a way to get these teams to beat our enemy, he was going to have to find a way to make these teams operate like a smaller team. He figured out that it was about understanding how silos work and how to break them down. So here's what he learned. If we had to boil down what McChrystal learned into 3 lessons, it'd be this. Like Snowden did in the business world, McChrystal learned that complicated is different from complex. Okay, complicated is the inside of a 747. If you know what the gauges mean, you can fly it and you'd never crash, you know, weather permitting. But complex is like a rainforest. Okay, you don't know what's going to happen. And that's the way I would characterize someone coming to you with an undifferentiated sleep-wake complaint. It's complex, okay? It's a problem that has to be explored at the same time that it's being solved. Second lesson, traditional planning-based, reductionist, efficiency-based, top-down management fails in complex situations. This is what McChrystal realized when he was in there running from a standard command structure within this crazy environment. The third lesson, collaborative management, it works. And McChrystal learned this in real time. And I'm going to tell you what he did. But it's hard to achieve, okay? It works, but it's hard to achieve because it requires overcoming silos, okay? So if he figured out in real time how to socially engineer a solution to a very daunting problem, how to unify disparate, competitive, heavily siloed groups into a naturally agile and cohesive whole, He made them function like a well-trained soccer team. So this is what he said. We needed to promote the kind of knowledge that arises on small teams. We dubbed this goal, this state of engagement, emergent adaptive organizational intelligence, shared consciousness, okay? Shared consciousness is, I think, what we are trying to achieve, by the way, with our patients. And it became the cornerstone for our transformation. So in other words, General McChrystal realized that his system was suffering from siloed thinking, and he resolved to put a stop to it by figuring out what was causing it. He determined that the cause was that his teams weren't working together. And the reason that they weren't working together, each was too specialized to understand the complexity, to understand the whole Leviathan, okay? The players couldn't see the whole field, and they couldn't predict each other's actions. They lacked a shared understanding of complexity, and they lacked the behavioral bonds to act on it. So his actual $64,000 question, to the question of how to create cross-team communication, is this. Number one, you've got to have systemic understanding. Every important player on the field needs to understand the complexity of the whole. So every player has got to see the whole field and know what the other players are going to do. Number two, the teams have to have strong lateral connectivity, which for McChrystal meant a combination of trust and empathetic bonding. Okay, if you're Pele and you're playing off Messi downfield, you have to know what that other player is going to do, and you have to predict because you have some sort of empathetic understanding. Okay, so understanding that now this is a sort of an exercise in empathetic connectedness, we now have a different task. So how did he do this? Help his players see the entire Leviathan. He made his operational planning room into a shared workspace. He was never behind closed doors, okay? He encouraged team members to speak up. He asked questions, okay? In Snowden's language, he probed, okay? He was asking questions. In this way, everyone on the team could see the whole package, the entire complexity, so they could more instinctively understand their place in the mission. Those gathering the data would know what the intelligence people were looking for, okay? So they could improvise in the field. They felt empowered to make decisions that would help the entire task force, not just their own unit. So the bottom line is he empowered each of his teams with an operational view of the entire mission. The complexity was visible to all operational specialists, and he made the information flow deliberately two ways, okay? So this is another quote from Team of Teams. In this way, the members of the team all had access to a higher understanding of the complexity of the situation. Whatever efficiency is gained through silos is outweighed by the costs of interface failures. And interestingly, like I've been thinking about all these terms, silos and complexity, well before I read McChrystal, which is why it blew my mind that he dealt with this in a completely different forum. Whatever efficiency is gained, through silos is outweighed by the cost of interface failures. Amazing. So how did he accomplish the second goal? Lateral connectivity, strong lateral how do you make a ranger and a SEAL into pals? Answer, he mandated that each group would have to send an emissary to the other group. They would be embedded so that they could learn and they could bond. And again, this is sort of an exercise in empathy. How does it feel to be there? Have you walked a mile in their shoes? Now, at first, the individual tribes, they were really rejected this idea. They bristled. They were really thick with their morale as a tribe member. Everyone else sucks. They thought having an outsider in their midst would screw up their mojo. But as it happened, McChrystal provided the right kind of support from up above. And he made it sort of culturally the thing to send your best person to the other team. As McChrystal put it, if you can do without that person, send someone else. See, so the teams got competitive. They wanted their all-star. If you're a SEAL, you wanted your all-star to go represent with Delta Force. And what happened after that was magical. The teams started to understand the way the other teams would pivot, and they understood the language. And when someone was saying this, they actually meant this. So there became this unified mind that happened without direct orders. It happened naturally. Eventually, McChrystal's team of teams accomplished their goal, which was eliminating the slipperiest terrorists on the planet. They also put language to an important lesson in management science, and one that's still being taught in management training today. And that lesson is, responding to a complex environment is different from managing a complicated but predictable scenario. Okay, we keep getting back to this idea of complexity. It requires deliberate, consistent collaboration with participation from all stakeholders being actively sought and valued. Okay, in other words, success requires the team members to rise above their individual silos, and that requires understanding how silos work. Now, here's one more thought. In medicine, when we're taking care of people, the most important player on the team, the most important silo to engage is arguably this guy, patient. Each individual, each patient we see is a silo of one. They have their own narrative, they have their own understanding and their own way of kind of thinking about this problem. If they're the most important player on the team, how do we collaborate with them? How do we share this consciousness with them? You know my answer. So again, we can find it. But today, I'm not going to take you through all 5 fingers, because one of the things that I hope you'll come away with is this is not just a learning tool for us. This is a teaching tool. And it turns out that teaching about these 2 factors, circadian misalignment and thinking about pharmacologic factors, isn't something that many people feel comfortable with, because there's a lot of jargon and there's the seeming, if a doctor prescribes something, then that's not something we can think about. I put these 2 factors first because I wanted my fellows to consider these first. And I actually think that as we teach our patients, we can teach them our process and they can help us solve. So how are we going to talk to our patients about these things? That's what we're going to do next. So circadian misalignment. So in order to understand what this means, we have to understand how sleep works. Okay, so just so you know, there's some jargon here, but this is stuff that I would literally teach my patients, because patients look stuff up on the internet and they like to know what the jargon means. So I figure, why not just give them the language? So this two process model of sleep-wake regulation is what we're going to talk about. And by this, I mean there are 2 fundamental processes that govern how sleep work, 2 systems. Okay, they go by the names process S and process C. A lot of you have probably heard this before. So if you know this information, this is going to be an introduction on how I would teach this to my patients. Because again, I think that's the important magic key here, is that if our patients understand this too, then that gives us another player on the field that can help solve problems. So process S is homeostatic sleep pressure. Process C is circadian fluctuation of alertness. So let's talk about process S first. Process S is the idea that as you are awake and doing stuff, you are building up toxins in your brain. Okay, toxins in your brain. I'll show you a cartoon next. That's the Fumes in the Attic cartoon. This is how I'd explain it to my patients, is that as you're going through your waking day and you're building up these breakdown products of metabolism, things like prostaglandins and interleukins and adenosine being a breakdown product of ATP, all of these things are building up in the brain like a soupy mess, almost like fumes in the attic. And as soon as you fall asleep, those fumes get dissipated and they tend to blow away, almost like you've opened up windows. So you can see in this diagram, it's steadily building up during wakefulness, and then it goes away during sleep. Okay, so if we're going to show that in cartoon form, this is actually an image from our book. It just goes through a little graphic novel representation of, going through the day, you're building up fumes, and then going to sleep allows this cross breeze to occur. And then you might see that there's an objection there in the last 2 panels. People saying, yeah, well, if it's all about fumes, then, why is it that I can have these other experiences, like feeling tired after lunch and not being able to stay away from my meeting, and then suddenly I feel better and have this second wind before I go to bed? Like, what gives? And the answer is there's a different process at work, and that's the final frame shows this hand on this meter, this strange ARAS-o-meter, ascending reticular activating system is what that stands for, but that actually is on a dial. So that's what we're going to learn about next. So process C is a fluctuation of the degree to which that alertness knob is turned up or down. Okay, and you can see here in this corresponding chart here that the camel humps below, you get to a kind of a high point of circadian alertness towards the end of that peak of process S process S homeostatic sleep pressure. So you can see that these systems can kind of work together. The ascending reticular activating system is the series of deep brain structures that runs alertness. Okay, you can see there's no test on this, so don't be intimidated by the names here. What I want you to understand and internalize is that these are physical structures, and these physical structures can be damaged. In fact, if you did a really mean experiment and you burned up all of these with an electric probe, you would create a being that no longer wakes up at all. That person would be in a coma, and their EEG would look like sleep. Okay, so these structures are required to keep you awake, and they're on kind of a volume knob, and that volume knob is linked to our circadian cycle. This is another image from the book. I'm not going to read it, but it's kind of a little Shel Silverstein poem about process S and process C and how they frolic together. So when I teach my patients about process C, I want them to understand that their circadian alertness is in flux. Okay, so I teach them 5 things. First, process C is really about the fluctuating volume of the ascending reticular activating system. How much is that alertness center turned up or down? The circadian sleep phase is the optimal timing for prolonged sleep. This is a time frame where the ARAS is deliberately dialed down for a prolonged period. Okay, so there is actually an optimum time for people to sleep for a prolonged, i.e. usually nocturnal interval. The forbidden zone, how cool is that? Sounds like a 50s sci-fi movie. But the forbidden zone is a time frame of intense ARAS activity. If you remember from the camel humps, that happens at the very end, at the very peak of homeostatic sleep pressure, i.e. at the end of the waking day. We're going to see why that's important in a minute. Teaching people about the forbidden zone gives them power over it. The dim light melatonin onset. Boy, that sounds science and nerdy. DILMO, DLMO, call it Captain DILMO, because all this is a sudden upswing in melatonin concentration, and it is the captain's voice. I call it Captain DILMO. The captain's voice coming on over the airplane loudspeaker saying, put your tray tables up, put your seats in the full upright position. Okay, we are coming in for a landing. Without Captain DILMO, the transition to sleep doesn't happen right. Okay, we're going to find out that you can screw with Captain DILMO by what you're doing. Teaching people this is empowering. Finally, phase delaying forces. I teach people about phase delaying forces. This is not just light. We've all heard about light, especially blue light, especially at the end of the day. We all have that screen warming thing that happens, but it's not just light. There's lots of stuff that will tend to delay the sleep phase. And when I show you the circadian rhythmo wheel next, this is going to make sense as to why this is important. But it's light, excitement, socializing, eating, upright posture, elevated body temperature, right? Think jumping around the room, eating pizza, playing a video game, talking to friends, lights bright on. That person is plagued with phase delaying forces. So let's look at why that's important. If I can switch come on now, this is slow because it's a big image. So this is my circadian rhythmo wheel. I love this gadget because this helps people see. This helps people understand. This is available to everybody free. You can get it from my website. You don't have to remember that complicated thing. Just go to empoweredsleepapnea.com, and Rhythmo Wheel is one of the choices. You can print it out and you can put it together. That central circle spins, okay? So in this example, this is a 24-hour clock here, and midnight is at the top and noon is at the bottom. So we've got the circadian sleep phase in that blue cloud. You can see that's dialed in from 10 to 6, okay? Right before that circadian sleep phase, you see there the forbidden zone. And on top of that is the DILMO. Okay, now I want you to draw your attention to the light bulbs. You see the light bulbs with the red arrows there right underneath? That's what happens when you shine light in your eye. The next day, that's the force that's going to be put on the circadian sleep phase to rotate that later the next day, okay? As you move through the night, you see that there's a time frame right about 3 in the morning, which is the core body temperature minimum, by the way. At about 3 in the morning, light starts to have the opposite effect. It's going to start to push back. Okay, so you can start to get this idea that light is something that is kind of a wrestling match. Whatever happens at night and whatever happens in the morning is going to determine what happens to the overall sleep phase in general. And what people are doing these days, post Tesla, post Edison, post electric lights, is they're getting a whopping dose of phase delaying influences in this nocturnal time frame, and they are literally changing the timing of their circadian phase. Okay, teaching people this stuff using these visual tools will empower them to do something about it. In my experience, training people about sleep hygiene in the absence of this understanding will create an angry patient. People can understand their own rhythm by doing something called a sleep diary. So if you Google 2-week sleep diary or AASM sleep diary, you'll get this PDF. You can print this out for your patients and they can kind of follow their progress and they can get an idea where their prolonged sleeping intervals are. Here's how you teach them how to do it. Put it by your bedside, do it in the morning, not in real time. Indicate where you got into bed with a down arrow. My animations are out of phase here. Indicate when you were asleep by, here we go, by shading in. Okay, so this person got into bed, was frustrated, got out of bed, got back into bed, and then slept for 5 hours and then got out of bed at 6 in the morning. Okay, so that's a single entry. In the book, we had an example which was meant to make you sort of look at it and see all the interesting things that she was doing. But you can see here that during the work week, meaning Monday through Friday, general bedtime is really late, sleep onset is really late, 2 to 3 in the morning, and wake time as a result of having to go to work is roughly 6 to 7 a.m., 7 to 8 a.m. during the work week. And then during weekends, this person is sleeping in, crossing over the noon line there. So this is an example of someone who has probably an intrinsically delayed circadian sleep phase, and they're trying to make up for it on the weekend. Now, if this person were to come to you and talk to you about their problems, what they would tell you is, Doc, I'm having trouble getting to sleep. I have insomnia. Because this is what their circadian rhythm wheel would look like, dialed in for a sleep phase of 2 a.m. to about 10 a.m. Look where their forbidden zone is, okay? And look what our patient was doing during the time frame right before sleep. All that television, can't sleep, up and down. You know, TV involves not just light in the eyes from the tube itself, but it's also emotional content and excitement. So a lot of phase delaying influences going on there. Okay, so what you can show this person now is, oh my gosh, you're trying to go to bed on your forbidden zone. Let's talk about how we're going to manage these behavioral issues that contribute to this sensation of, quote, insomnia. Okay. Now, that's about talking about the thumb, circadian misalignment. A brief introduction. If you want to learn more, there's resources on my website, and of course, you can listen to the podcast as well. Or, of course, it's all in the beautiful blue book. As far as exploring pharmacologic factors, that's the index finger. Okay, I found that my sleep fellows who came from all walks of life, often they were neurologists or psychiatrists, they often wouldn't even look at the med list. There being cardiology meds on there, you know, and I'm a recovering primary care doc. So I considered it totally my territory to get in there and find out what had been inappropriately prescribed, what could be changed, is this the right thing, what's the data for this? And the resource that I use for all of this evidence-based medicinary is called Clinical Epidemiology, a Basic Science for Clinical Medicines. This book, it's a great book. It's still in print. You can still find copies of it. I have the second edition. It's gone into further editions. The term evidence-based medicine came from this book, although it was never used in the first edition. This is a series of clinicians who are trying to figure out how to become better purveyors of the literature on behalf of the individual patient. So this is a patient-centered document. And they actually have a chapter in there called Deciding Whether Your Treatment Has Done Harm. So this is kind of my playbook when I'm thinking about this for people. The rules of engagement for this, if you want to say, well, hey, you know, that drug you're taking is causing insomnia, nightmares, daytime drowsiness, restless legs symptomatology, making your sleep apnea worse. If you want to say anything like that, well, there's ways you can go back and test whether that's true. Is the association consistent from study to study? Has this actually been described? Has it ever happened? Okay. Has it happened on a repeated basis? Is there signal in the literature that this agent is capable of causing the kind of harm you're worried about? Okay. Is the temporal sequence of events correct? Like, did their insomnia started 25 years ago? It's probably not the beta blocker that they started last week that's to blame. Okay. Is there a dose response gradient? If they take more of it, is the problem worse? Okay, that would make sense. And that would be sort of a probing type of enterprise with the patient. And does the association make sense? Okay, is this a sensible and reasonable thing to talk about? Now, we are getting on 51 minutes. So I think I'm not going to tell this story. I'm going to invite everybody to read if you want. But this is another reason why I love the 5-finger approach. Because in this story, I'll cut to the chase. This very nice lady was not using her CPAP machine because of terrible nightmares that had started a specified time frame ago. And I made my medical student go through her med list together by teaching the patient the 5-finger approach, going through this. And we found that her problem was coming from a drug called valcyclovir, which actually hadn't been described to cause nightmares. So it didn't fit one of the criteria that I talked about on the last slide. It hadn't been described to cause nightmares, but it was a drug that was known to cause central nervous system dysfunction on occasion. So we talked about it. We talked about stopping the drug. And long story short, it completely made her nightmares go away, which were catastrophic. And she was able to re-engage with her CPAP machine again. And this had never been described in the literature. So I think it's an important concept that this is a navigational tool, not a pre-specified set of instructions for you. It's a way of navigating with your patients. These are available on my website and also in the slides for this talk. And Samantha, you can send those around if you'd like. This is basically adapted from our book, Drugs That Can Affect Sleep and Wake. So as for the other 3 fingers, as for the other 3 fingers, these are a little more self-explanatory, going through medical factors is the middle finger, I'm sorry. So medical issues that can disrupt sleep, psychiatric and psychosocial factors are probing the environment and the patient's mental health history. And I made the primary sleep diagnoses like sleep apnea, like restless leg syndrome, like narcolepsy. I deliberately made that the pinky finger so that my fellows wouldn't fall into the search satisficing trap. They would have to think about that last. So the 5 takeaways from this talk. The biggest one is that sleep apnea and the practice of sleep medicine in general, it's not complicated. This is not just the realm of an expert who knows everything. This is complex, and there is a difference. It makes a difference in terms of the management style that we have to use. And it also means that because it's complex, it requires that collaborative sort of bonding. And this is why the tone that we educate with, whether it's something scary or whether it's something approachable, is so important. And it's why we also level with our patients about how complex this actual environment is. Collaborative teamwork. Well, that required a shared consciousness of the system's complexity. Again, we have to go back to that idea of the entire island. How are we going to characterize this? How are we going to unpack this set of sleep-wake complaints you have? We're going to take it apart in a way that we all can talk about. In a patient-centered clinical relationship, the patient is arguably the most important person on the team. So if we're going to provide sort of a knowledge, a shared understanding of complexity, this has to be in a language that is embraceable and approachable. And this explains sort of in retrospect why we end up coming back to this kind of a fun and seemingly adventurous type of carefree environment for the Empowered Sleep Apnea Project. The complexity required that narrative structure, and it required that approachability. I'm telling you, you guys understand this better than anybody else. I wrote early on in my journey about how if there's one field in sleep medicine that seems to get it, it's the myos, because the root cause complexity for sleep-wake complaints, myos get complexity. They understand many moving parts, and when we zoom out from sleep apnea onto sleep medicine, we understand that there's lots of potential moving parts for sleep-wake complaints. And the 5-finger approach is a collaborative way of breaking that down. Finally, communicating and strategizing and collaborative understanding of circadian misalignment and pharmacologic factors. These two things require a little bit of technical skillery on our parts. So it requires a little bit of a mastery of understanding of process S and process C, the two-process model, and sort of an understanding of how to forensically investigate meds or other treatments as potential causative factors for harm. Okay. The idea here is not that you can't do it. The idea is that you can. These are skills that can be learned, and I hope this is a nice introduction to that. This is my final slide. This is my vision of what we should be as a team of teams. We all have our collective understanding, but we embrace and surround our patients. And this is kind of my newer understanding of where things stand. So any queries on this, just go ahead and go to our website. There's lots to look at, including a blog and other fun stuff, cartoons and stuff there. So with that, references are the only two slides that remain. I'm going to leave it on this slide, and I'm going to stop sharing here. Yep. And we made it through. Okay, so I didn't hear any chatter or feedback, so I had this sudden belief that I would be alone in the room. So when I came back.
No, you're so, everyone is in the room. And if you take a look at the chat, just a ton of effusive response, because I think you're encapsulating a lot of the parts that become challenging as the advocate for the patient when you're dealing with systems of complexity. And I think that's what you're talking about here. And part of that system is insurance. And I think the codifying and the diagnoses, even in our treatments, become so whittled down that it's almost forces people into less critical thinking and more checkbox code this, what diagnosis, therefore they can get this for those progress notes that are sent to the insurance company. Mm-hmm. So I do think that it's incredibly difficult to figure out how to navigate it, but you're coming back to the empowerment piece, which is educating the patient, and not by sending them off into the Google bathroom stall door, but by a book that brings in their specific experience. And that's what you really brought to this. And I just want you all to run, not walk, to empoweredsleepapnea.com. I'm telling you, this book is so.
Do we need a visual aid? Hold on.
It's
sorry, I don't want this to feel like product placement.
No, it isn't.
But it's beautiful, and it is. I designed it specifically because I wanted it to be something that people wanted to hold on to. You know, so you all know I started writing this textbook in 2020, and the first iteration of it was god awful, and I kept rewriting that iteration for about 6 months, and it was just coming out terrible, and it was intimidating, and the jargon. And when I tried to put humor into it, it started to feel like a man with a knife smiling at you, you know, so it wasn't any more friendly. So this is when I decided that I needed some help, and I decided to recruit Ellen into the project. And maybe there was something conversational about this unfolding of complexity that we could do with the podcast. And it was the understanding that it had to be fun. If it was going to be accessible, it had to be beautiful. So this is why the book is kind of expensive. It retails now at $99, but you guys being fans, you can get a discount. So HUZZAH, huzzah, all caps, at BookBaby checkout will get you $25 off that.
Wow.
10% off the ebook. You know, I put the ebook out there as an affordable option for people. The book's an expensive piece to make because it's glossy and it's beautiful, and that was by design, because I felt like we had to overcome a limbic limitation to accepting this information, and the only way I could do that was with something that was just a Disneyland ride. Does that make sense?
It is, and that's what we need in the waiting room as people are trying to figure out where they land in this.
It's a good place for it. People in the waiting room, people discover it and they want to take it home. So, you know, Dr. Paul Henny said he had it in his waiting room for a day, and somebody's already snagged it from him. So, you know, I actually picture that this could be a great resource for people. They, you know, different offices can have 2 or 3 copies. They can lend them out so that the financial hit isn't to the patients. But once people learn this, they'll teach each other. It's like, I think of it as crows teaching crows. We will teach each other the language of this complexity once we get our heads wrapped around it.
Absolutely. And, we're out of time, sadly, which is, I'm sad because we could continue, and I want people to be able to jump in. Bahar, your hand is raised, but we're literally out of time.
I just wanted to kind of quickly come in here, Samantha. Thank you so much for bringing my good friend, Dr. Dave McCarty. I've been blessed to know and work with him for just as long as he's been on this journey. And I'm just thrilled to see that the glimpse of light is coming through. And I think we're all just the light workers in this process. And Dave, thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
I'm so glad you were here, Bahar. I didn't know you were here. Thank you.
Oh, I heard you, Dave. And I tell you, I was thinking, you're amazing. Thank you so much for coming in here and bringing this to my favorite group. Samantha, thank you for organizing this. And I just wanted to come in here and say that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this is great. I think, Dave is going to be at AAPMD, and I think you all should be there as well. So please make that happen, because we can all get together and you can ask questions personally to Dave when we have our AOMT cocktail party. And, we have a whole bunch of things planned, and I want you all to be there. So September 7th to the 10th, AAPMD, please use the discount code. I sent it in the email. But again, you bring a lot of resources, Dave, and it's just how your brain works. Slipping on the ice of the Pickwick Papers. I'm thinking of your Pickwick. Your literary language is also a way to connect. And so I want to say you're doing a beautiful job. Keep it up. And everybody is clearly so grateful. So
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's an exercise in rediscovering humanity, I think. Ultimately, we're trying to find the humanity under this label, the essence of this human being who has this narrative. We're trying to find a way to better function, better health. And it's not all encapsulated in a label. So we have to have a different way of talking about it.
So true. Well, you really kicked us off into this beautiful space for the weekend. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We will be back next week. And
happy coffee.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Dave. And remember, go to empoweredsleepapnea.com. Huzzah, Huzzah. I'm telling you, that's the book to have in your waiting room. It's going to open up your dialogue, empower people. That is the book. It's a beautiful conversation starter. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Stay in touch.
Everyone,
contact me through the website.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave.
Bye.
Bye.